Overclockers UK sent over the Bitfenix portal. This is a rather interesting ITX chassis, certainly a sleek design. This one happens to be the windowed model. We're going to take a look at it, so do stick around. As I mentioned, this is the windowed panel, so with nothing in it, you can see all the way into the sort of internal chassis. This is quite a sleek design with the power button and power LED on the front, and on from looking at the front anyway, the right hand side, you have the sort of front I/O, which is two USB 3.0 ports, headphone and microphone jack, and a reset button, which is also the hard drive activity LED. You also have a large amount of ventilation across the top and across the bottom as well, especially where the rails attach at the bottom. At the bottom of the case, you'll notice the rails that hold the chassis up. These are very stylish, they also fit very well with the aesthetic, and while of course this doesn't necessarily fit with the Aperture Science portal, it does certainly look pretty cool. Like many of the other exterior panels on this chassis, it does look like you can actually remove these with screws, so if you do want to mod this chassis, it does look very easy to do. Taking a look at the back of the chassis, you'll notice the two PCIe slots up at the top, as well as obviously the standard motherboard layout, an absolutely just adorable little tiny fan, and an SFX power supply mount. To get inside the case, you need to remove two screws that are at the bottom at the back. These can be quite difficult as the way that they're mounted is directly vertically, so you're going to be grating your hands along the metal mesh for the fan grill at the back there as you're trying to undo them, so I really wish that they'd put them in either horizontally or even at an angle or something like that to make them easier to access, but when you do, you can then slide the chassis out. The slider does very much look like some sort of just standard drawer slider that's painted black, although it does work very well. I would recommend not having any components in this when you're actually sliding it out if you're going to leave it there for any point in time, as you can see in this footage. But if you do install components, I really do recommend just taking it off as soon as you slide it out, as you will damage the slider, as Bitfenix also mentions. The internal chassis cage itself is actually only attached to the slider by two small pegs, which means that you can just lift off that chassis cage very easily. I would recommend watching out for the front panel I/O cables, which are actually really very long and come through the back at the top. Just as you're pulling them out, make sure you don't destroy them by accident, and otherwise you then have access to build in the chassis. Taking a look at the internal chassis, you can also see with a power supply mount at the bottom and the ITX motherboard mounts in the center. The standoffs come pre-included as well, which is very nice and pre-installed. There is a crossbar that sits kind of in the way of a lot of stuff, and you can't remove that as that is riveted to the chassis, but it does add a lot of support, so I suppose that's a trade-off that you might expect. And of course, you do also have two 3.5-inch hard drive bays at the front and a 2.5-inch hard drive cage, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to fit 2.5-inch SSDs. It just doesn't seem to be wide enough, and I don't know whether that's a manufacturing issue with the units that I have, or whether that's something that needs to be addressed in perhaps a future revision. At the front of the case, you have a 120mm fan pre-included, and of course this will be where you're mounting your 120mm water cooler if you so fancy. Of course, it does fit sort of slim or low profile CPU coolers if you prefer, but you can mount a 120mm radiator as well if you fancy. I would recommend having your tubing in a more optimum position than I did for just the distance, as it is quite far, especially for relatively small 120mm coolers, and the tubing might not quite stretch to that, so I do recommend just sort of planning this out in advance. The GPU mount wasn't quite what I was expecting. I was expecting some sort of split chamber design where the graphics card would sit on a plate so you'd have lots of support for it, and it would sit a little bit higher up so you could actually see it very clearly through the window, but unlike some of the marketing images I've seen for this case, the graphics card actually sits about 3 inches below the glass, or the plastic here, so that is just something to be aware of. Because of the way this is done, this means that there is no support for the graphics card, especially for sagging at the back, especially if you have a big and heavy graphics card, and you need to be very, very careful with what graphics card you choose here. Now, they've marketed it with Asus Strix graphics cards, and the reason for that is that they actually have indented PCIe power ports, so when I tried to use a Zotac Amp Extreme 980, that just would not fit, as the power ports were basically where you'd expect for most graphics cards, so I suspect that MSI graphics card won't fit in here, at least the Gaming X models. I think some reference cards should fit okay, but you really do need to be very careful, and you have to be very selective for what GPU you put in this. Building the chassis was relatively easy, especially since you can basically take out the entire inner section, build the PC, and then put it in, but I would mention that installing the front panel I/O cables was actually really very difficult. practical, considering that most ITX motherboards dot around where all the front panel connections are, and if you've already included a tower heatsink or something, then really very much just good luck to try and get some of those in. So it can be quite difficult to get that sorted, and obviously you do need an SFX power supply, and especially the design of the chassis, there really isn't too much room for power supply cables there either. I mean, the Co-Link 450 watt power supply that Overclockers UK sent me to do this video, which thank you for that by the way, was you know, relatively small, obviously short cables being an SFX power supply, and yet it was still, I had to stuff most if not all of the cables down into the hard drive bays, which meant that you could really only solve maybe one hard drive properly. So that is something to be aware of, and just something to think about when you're building in it. Now of course, like pretty much every chassis on the market, this one does have its problems, namely the knuckle dusting that you might get when trying to open the case, obviously the SSD bracket that doesn't quite fit SSDs, and of course the situation for trying to pick a GPU, and I suppose the front panel connectors as well. But overall, I think if you want something that is this styling, which is certainly very unique, you want a very cool looking ITX system, especially one that you can sort of sit in your living room or something like that and be rather stealthy, very good looking, and certainly not an eyesore to anyone, then this is certainly a nice shout. Perhaps you might want to go with the non-windowed version just so that you can have a more sleek aesthetic. If you do go with a windowed one, just do bear in mind that there is quite a lot of distance between the graphics card and the window at the top, so you will have to sort of look down into it to be able to see the graphics card at all, and you do see the front panel connections at the front as well if you're looking at it from sort of the behind angle. So yeah, there is a couple of things with it, but I certainly do like it quite a lot, at least in terms of aesthetic anyway. When it comes to scoring, I think I'm going to go for a 3.5 for 5 for money with a 4 for performance. I think functionality really is the kind of key thing for this case. It's something that they've tried to innovate and tried to do something new and fresh with, and I do respect that quite a lot, but there are a few trade-offs to that in the problems that it kind of brings, so do bear that one in mind. I think that's going to be maybe a 3.5 or a 4 there. I think in terms of styling, for me, it has to be a 5, and TechteamGB score, I think I'm going to round it off at a 4. I think this is really worth money if you're after a very stylish ITX chassis. This can certainly be a main rig, or it can be, you know, as I said, a living room type PC. It's certainly very stylish and might fit your aesthetic if you like it. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. So if you want to know more about this case or the price, then check out the link to Overclockers UK in the description down below. I've also left some more generic Amazon and Overclockers UK affiliate links, so if you could use those, that'd be utterly fantastic, and I'd love you forever, as it really does help me out. Also, if you want to help me out even further, you can check out some of the TechteamGB merch that's mostly t-shirts and hoodies and stuff like that, where we have some TechteamGB related stuff and some just generally funny tech stuff. So if you can check that out, that would be fantastic. Of course, feel free to follow me on Facebook and Twitter as well for more updates, giveaways, news, videos and all that sort of stuff. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for watching. Check out some of the other videos. I'll leave it over here for you, and the subscribe button over this side. And otherwise, yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you all in the next video.